the church on Sundays, or if you're new to this place, or you're checking it out, or you're visiting from out of town, we're really glad that you're here. I know I say that on behalf of the leadership of this church, and Chuck Berry, who is the pastor here. He's away, as Danny and Larry said. My name is Chris Horn, and my family and I here, we attend here, we are members here, and I work with RUF, and RUF is a campus ministry at Appalachian that is the campus ministry of this denomination that the church belongs to. And so we partner together with this church and to work with students on campus. I want to do two things before I get started to make sure that they happen. First, and this is going to be awkward for y'all, so it's okay, but if you are graduating this semester or over the summer, would you please stand up so that we can clap for you and honor you? I know you don't want to stand up. You guys, it's a huge accomplishment, and I know you guys still, like, your worst nightmare is to stand up in the middle of the church. But we're really proud of you, and well done. And I'm going to ask you guys to do something else, and I'm a little bit on a limb here because I'm like using up all the capital with my students by asking them to stand up 2 times. But I think sometimes it's hard to really sort of picture that you're partnering with the ministry, because you don't see what's going on all the time, because we're sort of in campus world and you guys are in your worlds. You're at SP or you're working or whatever, you're in school with your kids. And it's hard to see the impact of ministry in the church sometimes because there's just a bunch of faces. So this is not in any way to, anyway, if you are involved with RUF in the sense that you show up to RUF, would you please stand up? All right, thank you. You can sit down. Thank you. Oh, yes. And I only bring that up to say we're really grateful to partner with this church, and what we do as a ministry greatly overlaps with the ministry of this church. And so I'm privileged to be here preaching with you. I'm privileged to be part of this church with you, and I'm privileged to care for these students with you. So thank you for that opportunity. We're going to be in Exodus. I got the clicker. You know, if you go to church here, you know Chuck is big on the clicker. So, and I made 3 slides. So I go through them. So we're good. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 1 and 2. Exodus is the second book of the Bible. If you have a Bible and you want to turn there. If you need a Bible, I know there are Bibles on hand here that the church will just let you take along with you. Stories are very powerful. There are certain stories that really sort of connect with us and help and make us live out of them. You guys have noticed we have kids, or you're around kids a lot. When my kids dress up as Elsa and Anna from Frozen, they don't say, I'm pretending to be Elsa and Anna, or I am playing Elsa and Anna. What do they say? They say, I am Elsa, and she is Anna. You know, it's always a fight for who gets to be Elsa. And speaking of, if you're a child and you need to leave for children's church, this is the time to do that too. All right, good thing I remember that, because there would have been a lot of small people angry with me. Anyway, they say I am Elsa. Like it's not just a story. It's something that you're living out of. If you read The Onion, which is like a sort of satire of the news. When the new Star Wars movie came out, there was an Onion article called "Guy Wearing Chewbacca Costume Torn Between Seeing Star Wars and The Big Short." You know, he's standing like, he says, it'd be kind of interesting to hear the story behind the housing market collapse, but on the other hand, I've been camped out to see The Force Awakens for the past 8 days. Clearly, there's something about the story and the mythology of Star Wars that captures people so much that they will literally assume the role of a character and wait for weeks for the movie to come out. And of course, someone that's dressed like Chewbacca is going to see Star Wars. You know, that's why it's a joke. And that's why people laugh. And as we come to Exodus this morning, Exodus is the story. The story of what happens in the book of Exodus is what God wanted to define his people's imaginations for generations. God wanted the story of Exodus to be the story that they live out of, the thing that captures them, the thing that motivates everything that They do. And there's a story, I would argue. All of you guys have a story that you're living out of that determines what you do, what you love, where you move, what you do with your children, where you go to school. And God wants this story, the story of the book of Exodus, the story of God rescuing his people from sin and slavery and taking them to a new and a good land, to be the story that motivates your life. So we're gonna read this text, and then we will dive right in. So Exodus chapter 1. This is on the screen here. I don't usually have a screen, so I'm a little freaked out. Like someone's gonna write a dirty word there. This is the word of the Lord. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. It works, okay. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread about. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and all kinds of work in the field. And all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." And then a couple verses from chapter 2. Starting in verse 23. During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. This is the word of the Lord. Let's ask God's blessing on it. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for this gathering of people here. Some of us are very sure why we're here this morning. Very much feel like we have a place here. And Lord, there are others of us that feel very weird here, that feel very out of place, that have questions that we're afraid to ask. Lord, a lot of us are just distracted or bored. But we ask that you, by your Spirit, would meet with us wherever we are, that you would give us hope, that you have good things for our story. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so what I want to do this morning is talk with you about the fact that you have a story and that God has a place in your story. So I'm going to do 3 questions. The first 2 questions we're going to kind of zoom through, and the third question we're going to stay on for a minute. So the first question is, how did you get here? I don't mean like, well, maybe how did you actually, I walked. But how did you get here? How did you get to Boone? How did you get to Cross Point? Everybody has a very unique path that your life has taken to bring you to this place. Maybe you're here just visiting your child who's in college. Very few people, interestingly, I don't know if any, people that usually come in this door for church are from Boone. Is there anybody here that's from Boone? Yeah, well, it's not a child. Okay, thank you. Yeah, like your parents, but your parents aren't from Boone. Did at least you guys are from? Like my kids are from Boone, which is weird to think about. Of all the places to be from, you're from Boone. But that means that the vast majority of us, unless your parents go here usually, came from somewhere else. Like you got here from some other place. Like, are you from the South? Like, what part of the country are you from? Maybe you're from overseas. Some of you guys are from overseas. Did you come from a great family? Or you can't wait to go home and see your parents, or you miss your parents dearly? Maybe not so much. Maybe you came from a hard family background. Maybe your family was like a hard scrabble, saving type. Maybe your family had money. Why did you come to Boone, of all places? Boone isn't like on the way to anywhere. It's not like, well, I was just passing through Boone on my way to Wilkesboro. There's not, it's not on the way really for anybody. Maybe you came here for college, like you came to Appalachian for school or Caldwell. A lot of people here, interestingly, in this church are involved in some other kind of ministry outside the church. Actually, the majority of people in this church. Like, my family and I came here to do RUF. Like, we weren't like, we just go to Boone and we'll find a job. You know, it's probably not a lot of people do that. I love Boone, by the way. It's not a crack on Boone. But some of you guys work for Samaritan's Purse. That's what brought you here. You work for Hope Pregnancy Center, Appalachian Mountain Leadership. A lot of things that brought you here. What brought you to Boone? Basically, the question is like, what is your backstory? What is your history? What are your beginnings? And for the people of Israel, they had a backstory too. They didn't just wake up in Egypt. In fact, they also weren't locals to Egypt. They got to Egypt by being brought there. Back in the day, thousands of years ago, in fact, thousands of years even before the time of Jesus, there was a guy, his name was Abraham. Well, at the time his name was Abram, because back in the Old Testament, God is always changing people's names, very confusingly, to different names that sound like their original name. And his name was Abram, and Abram was the most randomest person on the face of the earth. He was literally lived in the desert, and he worshipped the moon. And he came from a long line of moon-worshipping people. And God, the God who created all things and sustains all things, showed up to Abraham, and he changed his name to Abraham. Just thought it wasn't long enough. And changed his wife's name too. And he said, I'm going to do something amazing through you. I'm going to make you a people. And you're going to be my special people. Every person that lives on the earth is mine. I've created them. I knit them together. But you are going to be special. I'm going to do a special work in you. And he gave Abraham a son. His name was Isaac. It was very surprising because Abraham was super old. And then Isaac had a son. His name was Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons. And his son Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and ends up in Egypt. So long story short, these guys are here. Joseph ends up in Egypt. He becomes very powerful in Egypt, and there's a famine in the land. Okay? And Joseph's family is going to die from starvation. And his family actually comes there, and they reconnect with Joseph. It's a long, beautiful story that you can read in Genesis. It's lovely. But long story short, they came to Egypt because they were starving. They needed food, and Egypt was able to provide that for them. A need drove them there. And then when they got there, they did what God's people are supposed to do, apparently, when I look around. They had lots of babies, and they had lots of children. And they filled the land. They were what God wanted them to be. They were fruitful people. And they multiplied in the land. Okay? So basically what started as 12 great grandkids of this super random guy in the desert named Abram, now are in Egypt hundreds of years later, and there are hundreds of thousands of people, okay, living in Egypt. The point is, your backstory really matters. Your beginnings, how you get to a place, affects who you are in that place. William Faulkner, who's a great Mississippi writer, is famous for saying the past isn't gone, it isn't even past. You know, there are things in your backstory that are such a part of your story now, and they shape who you are. So the first question is, how did you get here? The second question is, what has gone wrong for you? There are things in every person in this room's life that have gone poorly, that have not gone the way that we wanted them to. Your story has conflict and drama, okay? Just by showing up, it does. Things don't go according to plan. A lot of you have experienced real disappointment. Not just like, man, I wish that had turned out differently, but like an abiding and deep, you think about it every day kind of disappointment. Maybe Boone isn't your first choice, maybe your job isn't your first choice, maybe your spouse isn't your first choice. Students, you've changed your major a couple of times. Some of you have changed your major a lot of times, like more than 10. I won't say any names. But you know who you are, Olivia. Maybe you transferred schools. Maybe the thing is, for freshmen, and I'm going to talk a lot about RUF, and the reason why I had people stand up is so you know sort of what we're doing, because it doesn't really do anybody any good if I get up here and just don't talk about RUF, I guess. Because this is what God's doing right across the street. But for freshmen, by this time of the year, next week is like the last week before finals. By this time of the year, freshmen are usually on your second or third friend group. Like you started out like, my roommate is going to be my best friend that lives with me in Huey Hall, and we're going to be best friends forever, and now you don't even talk to your roommate anymore, you've changed rooms. So for a lot of us, things have been really very difficult, very challenging. We don't talk about it a lot from up here, because people like me and Chuck and people sitting in the front don't know how to talk about this stuff to a large group of people, but a lot of you guys have been abused. You've experienced abuse in your life. I'm very sorry. A lot of you guys have experienced serious trauma that you didn't ask for. Let me just say, you're not the only one. There are lots of people in this church that have had experiences like that. And so you're not here and you're not alone. That's a great lie, that you're here and you're alone. Maybe you've experienced divorce, maybe your parents are divorced, maybe your kids have had a rough go of it. I'm scattershotting everywhere. Okay? Maybe your job is unfulfilling. I already said that twice, that doesn't mean my job is unfulfilling. I'm living the dream. Maybe you found out something about your spouse and you're like, wish I didn't know that. Maybe you've messed up and you're afraid that people are going to find out. There are experiences in each of your lives that make your life heavy and complicated. And maybe that's the thing that brought you here today. Like that's why you came to church, because something has happened. Or maybe it's the reason why you're like, this is probably my last time I'm going to come here, because now they're getting a little close to my situation, and I have to move over to find another place where I can hide. I don't know where you are. I was talking to Brian Lowe, who is my friend and runs the Hope Pregnancy Center, and we had a women's conference for RUF girls here, and Dell was on the panel, and thanks for doing that, Dell. It was really wonderful.
I loved it.
You loved it? Good. Well, they loved it too. So I wish I could have been here and experienced it, but then it would not have been a safe place for a women's conference to be. And anyway, but when I was talking to Brian, something he said that Dell shared with him was that how surprised you were that girls don't have friendships. I don't know if you guys know this. If you think about like what your biggest like need and issue is in your life, I don't know what it is. But for like the vast majority of the 18,000 people across the street, it's that they're isolated and don't have real friendships. That they don't have someone to really talk to. Like if it all melted down, I don't have anyone I can talk to. But they're isolated. So we just had a senior cookout the other night, and everyone was sort of telling their story. And what most of the stories were about were the community of friends that people had found in RUF. Because they were drowning without them. I don't know what has gone wrong in your story. But for the Israelites, a few hundred years after they arrived in Egypt, things have gone very, very badly. Okay, so I can switch to the next slide. All right. If you look in the passage, they were enjoying a lot of favor and comfort, and then another Pharaoh comes along and he doesn't know Joseph. And he starts to be afraid. He's afraid because these Israelites don't look like us. They don't do the same religious stuff as us. They don't have the same sort of background, because their background has changed who they are, right? And so if a war breaks out, I'm afraid that they're going to join up with our enemies and they're going to topple us. So they become afraid of these people that they don't know and understand. It feels like the church sometimes. Does it not? And so they put them to work in hard slavery. But the passage says, the more that they oppressed the people, the more they multiplied. And the more they spread abroad. They couldn't just work them to death. So literally, the government begins to kill them. First, it's quietly, and we didn't read all this in the passage, but they tell these midwives, hey, it's a boy, don't let him live. Then they just begin to open about it, just throw him into the Nile. Open genocide. And just like that, they go from a privileged status to an oppressed status. They're enslaved. They're victims of genocide. Regardless, they're not at home anymore. Things have gone very poorly for them. And some of you guys feel that way. I'll just say it again. I probably feel like I'm saying this a lot. Some of you guys feel like you don't know where home is right now. Like you don't feel like you know where you belong. And let me just say, as a side point, I'm not the pastor of this church, but I know I speak for the pastor of the church and the people here, that no matter what you're going through, no matter what you have gone through, no matter where you're coming from, no matter where you've been, no matter what's happened to you or no matter what you've done, there is a place for you here to be honest and to be open, because we know that Jesus invites us to know him with no strings attached. That Jesus moves towards us. We're going to talk about that again in a minute. But my favorite rapper is Kendrick Lamar. Students know that. But he's great. He's a believer. He's a wonderful dude. And I will strongly edit him when I quote this. But he's got a great song called All Right. But anyway, he says, I'm messed up. That's not what he says. But he says, I'm messed up. You're messed up. But if God's got us, then we're going to be all right. And the church is a place that we can come into and go, I'm a mess. You're a mess. Okay, this is a strong message we get every week here. It's very great. But if God has us, then we're going to be okay. And sometimes we need people to remind us that we're going to be okay. But anyway, the difficult parts of your history and the things in your past are what drive who you are. I used to work on Hilton Head, cleaning windows, Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. And there is a sticker that you see all the time. You probably, in Charleston, the same thing. Since there are a lot of tourists, people identify themselves as locals. They will put a sticker on their car that says local. Maybe they do it up here too. This seems like a place that could happen. And like you say, I'm a local, like it's a point of pride. I'm not one of these Johnny-come-latelys. I'm a local. I'm from here. And so therefore, I can look down at you in some way. Because like where you're from defines who you are. Like you might say, I'm a classic middle child. My wife tells me I'm a classic only child. It is true. Or like, I don't really fit into this culture. I don't really fit here. Students, I hear from students a lot like, well, I can't get involved with church. I'm only here for 4 years. This isn't where I'm from. This isn't where I'm going to be. Right? Or like, you would understand if you'd been through what I've been through. But you can. Right? My mom was a single mom. And there's almost nothing that's more powerfully dominate who you are and your identity than I am a single mom raising a child of my own. It's a very powerful identity. But you see how it's from your history and it's from what's gone on in your life defines who you are. Maybe you're an empty nester, retiree, someone struggling with depression. You've always been a student, now you're about to graduate, you don't know what to do with that. That's hard. Anyway, we live out of these stories, and it can be hard to connect. The reason why we're setting this all up, it can be hard to connect what's my story and all these things that have happened to me, my past, my history. How does God connect to that? Like maybe you're here and you're very interested, like you're a Christian person, and you're just not really sure how like God's whole thing is like over here and I want to be part of that, but I don't know how it sort of enters into the fact that of my family or my trauma or whatever. Maybe you're just not interested at all. But regardless of where you're at, I would say we're all asking, where is God in all of this? That makes sense? You would not be here today. No one could have drugged you if you weren't at least sort of interested in knowing, where is God in my story? What does he think about my story? What does he have to say? And this is our third question is, where is God? Now, we're going to hang on this slide right here, hopefully. Oh, man, I suddenly have so much empathy for Chuck. Just change it to the next slide, Joe, whoever's back there. Thank you. Where is God? Your story craves resolution. The people of Israel cry out, this passage tells us, they cry out to God. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. And God does 4 things. Okay? These are the 4 money things you need to remember. So if you've been sleeping or not paying attention, now's the time to dial in. God does 4 things in this passage. Look at what he says. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant. God saw the people, and God knew. Okay? God hears, remembers, sees, and knows. And if you want to know how God is relating to you in your story, in your life, these are the 4 words you need to remember. God hears. What did God hear? Well, God heard their cry for help. He heard them crying out to him. They were in Egypt for a long time, and they were only like marginally religious before as a people. So who knows whether they're even crying out to God, the God of Abraham or not, or they're just crying out in general. I talk with our leaders a lot about the fact that there are tons of students on campus that are crying out just to anybody. And they don't know how. They don't even know what that means. They just know that they have something in Him. God hears your cries for help. Whether you at this point are knowing how to verbalize that to the God of the Bible or not, God hears you. God hears your cry. God hears your groanings. He heard their groaning. What does that even mean? It's very guttural, God hears your cry. He hears your groaning. The things that you can't verbalize. The longings in your heart that are more like hopes and dreams and fears and not like words. Sufjan Stevens is another musician that I really like, and he has a song, and he says, when you write a poem, I know the words, I know the sounds before you write them down. God knows the things that are the longings in your heart. God hears your cries and your groanings, no matter what. And sort of my question for you on that is, how do you expect God to answer to that? One of my dear friends who's a student, we talk a lot, and she's recently said to me, I know the Bible says that if I cry out, God will answer. But I don't know I don't feel like He's answering. And my question for her is the same as my question for you. How do you expect God to answer? Because God has provided a wonderful new community for her, and friends, and people speaking the gospel to her, the good news of Jesus to her. And so I've actually been able to sort of joyfully say, God is answering. God hears you. So God hears your cry, hears your groanings. God also remembered, the passage says. What did God remember? He remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God remembered that He made promises to His people. Promises that were made long before any of the people in Egypt were ever even alive. God remembered the promises that He had made. And His promises were to make them a special people, to give them a hope, to give them a new land, to give them a promised land that was going to be good for them, a hope and a future. I don't know if you think that you have a hope and a future. But God has made promises to give a hope and a future. And if you are at least slightly interested in that, if you are interested in knowing Jesus, those promises are for you. That God promises you a future. And I would say that most of my sin patterns in my life, and most of the sin patterns in your life, in some way deal with not believing that God is going to keep His promise to you. In the end, He's going to pull the rug out, or He's not going to deliver on them. So we looked at plan B. He's probably not going to work it out for my good, so I just need to make sure I got a little something on the side in case that doesn't work out. And I think that's usually because we're afraid of being disappointed. I don't want to put my hope in God, and then it doesn't really materialize. So I need to make sure I got something over here so I don't fall back on nothing. My question for you in this is, where do you need to remember that Jesus has made promises to you to never leave you or forsake you? God saw. What did God see? God saw their condition. He saw what they were going through. He was able to see what was going on with them. The people of Israel, we think, are really significant because there's this book that's like the top-selling book in the world, and we know all about them, right? This is a completely insignificant and random people. The Egyptians are the players here. The Israelites are nobodies. And so it couldn't possibly be expected that someone that could help them could see what they were going through and have compassion on them. Okay? Maybe you feel that way. Maybe you feel like the most anonymous person on the planet. God saw them, and God sees you. That is a very comforting and a very fearful and frightening thing, to realize that God sees everything in your life and in your story. There are things that you don't want anyone to see because you're afraid that once they know, they'll never talk to you again. And there are things that have happened that you desperately want people to have seen, but people can't understand. And what God is saying to us here is that God sees all the things done in secret. And He knows, is the last thing. It says He knew. God knew. That's so weird. If you read the passage, you're like, okay, God saw, He heard, He remembered, He saw, and God knew. It's very ominous, knew what? Obviously He knew, right? He saw it, He heard it. He remembered, like, of course he knew. The word doesn't mean that he just had knowledge of the situation. It's much more deeper and more sort of bowel level word. The word there means that God is deeply, knows in a deeply intimate way. That he's moved by what he sees and he knows. Just like when you know what's going to happen, And the word intent, the word sort of includes that he intends to act and he intends to respond. This is the beginning of Exodus. I just preached the book of Exodus in RUF this semester, so now I'm going all the way back to the beginning here. We're not going to look at the rest of the book, of course. Surprise, we're going to read the other, 38 chapters of Exodus. But if you don't know the story of Exodus, God very much intended to act. God showed up, and he got this guy named Moses, and he said, you're going to be the rescuer of this people. He sent plagues on Egypt. He split a Red Sea. He showed up to them in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. God dramatically rescued his people, and this was supposed to be their story, right? Of rescue. It was supposed to define them. That we were slaves, and now we've been set free. And that was their story for thousands of years, long after Moses was dead. It's interesting, Moses shows back up in the Bible, in the New Testament. There's just this point where Jesus is walking around. Again, Jesus, completely random person on the face of the earth. People don't know the guy. They don't know that he's God. He takes 3 of his disciples up on a mountain, and he gives them a little glimpse that he's God. He lets them see his glory. And 2 people show up with him. Elijah, who's a pretty bad man in the Old Testament, and Moses. Moses shows up with him, and the gospel writer says that what they're talking about was Jesus' exodus. That Jesus was going to do a work of rescue for his people. But the slavery that he was going to bring us out of is not slavery in Egypt. It's slavery that we bring on ourselves. Our own sin, our resentment, our failure. That Jesus has come to set captives free. But look, a lot of us think when we read the Bible that what it looks like is God just shows up and he saves me. He's still sort of away, but he shows up and he works. But that's not how the story works. Because if you think about the guy dressed up in the Chewbacca costume, again, to get back, of course, while we're on it, he's obviously very committed to Star Wars. Okay? He didn't just get the DVD on pre-release. He stood in line for 8 days dressed as a big, hairy individual. What about God becoming a human being? Not just putting on a costume, but actually becoming one of us, a real human being. When Jesus heard, it's not just that he heard, he cried out too for help. He heard the cries of the people he loved around him, literally, sat next to him. He didn't just remember God's promises, he remembered when he was facing death and everything was dark, he did everything he could to hold on to God's promises. Jesus didn't just see other people's condition, he experienced loss, injustice, abuse, torture. And when we say that God knows, we don't mean this God has an idea. We mean God knows what it feels like to be going through what you're going through right now. Because Jesus came in and experienced it for himself by becoming a person. And he is now at work to lead us into a new land. So, when I think about my story, I had a single mom, and my dad wasn't around. My dad still doesn't want to be around. I've asked him to be around, he's not interested. Just me and my mom. We lived in a trailer in Byron, Georgia, which of course you've all been there, so you know what it's like. And we never did church, we never did the Christian thing. And actually I was very hateful toward the idea of religion. Because I saw myself as a strong person that didn't need a crutch like all of you suckers do. And God didn't, from my perspective, show up in my life until I was in RUF in college when I heard the gospel for the first time with a guy preaching it. And and I began to trust Jesus. From my perspective, God showed up 20 years late. But this passage and the work of Jesus on my behalf tells me that he saw, that he heard, that he remembered the promises that he made that I wasn't even aware of. And he knew, like he knew me. And he was never far from me. And that is a good story. The other night at our senior cookout, one of our girls, her name's Lauren, she doesn't really talk that much. And we were sort of sharing some of our stories, and she said, when she grew up in the church, same kind of denomination that this church is part of. And she said, when I came to college, when I thought about God, I thought about what God could give me, what he could do for me. And she said, 4 years later, she said, now when I think about God, I just really want to know him. And that is a beautiful, wonderful story. Not of someone that can give you things, but someone that is there to know and be delighted in. And God has entered our story and made it fuller and sweeter. And I'm passionate about RUF, just while we're on, because for 4 years, you get to talk to someone about a God that wants to know them, and that changes the next 20, 30, 40 years of someone's life. And it happened to me. And what's going on in your story, just to close, where you believe Jesus isn't interested in working? Like, what is in part of your life where you're like, he probably doesn't want to have anything to do with that? He doesn't see or he doesn't know. Or where you're like, I'm unwilling to let him know. Or to let him see, or let him come into it. When you think about your friends, if you're a Christian, and I don't assume people here are, but if you have a friend that doesn't know Jesus and you do, what is the story that you're trying to invite them into? Like, what does what you put on Facebook, like what you just share on Facebook, tell about the story that you want to invite people into? Is it that you're afraid that the whole thing is falling apart, and that in just a couple of years, we're going to be in an unrecognizable, barren landscape? Or is it that God sees and he knows and he remembers and he has good things and that Jesus is part of it? What kind of story are you inviting your children to live in if you have kids? Is it a story where they have to do everything right? And they have to get into the right places and know the right things? Or else it's not going to be okay? Or is it a story that God the Father has made them beautiful promises and he just wants them to walk in them? And this one last word of comfort for you. Your loss, your hurt, your unwillingness to hope because you're afraid of being disappointed, your fear of the future, Jesus is not calling you to act like it doesn't exist. And he's not calling you just to get over it. I talked to a girl the other day, she was deeply, deeply abused. And she said, it's okay, I've given it to God. And I was like, can we meet more? Because she thinks that she just needs to be all right. And then it's going to go away. Jesus isn't calling you to do that. Jesus is simply reminding you this morning that he has a bigger and fuller and sweeter story that he wants to work and that he calls us to be part of, that he wants to set you free and bring you into a new and good land with him forever.